December 1951. The wind tore across the Korean highlands like a blade, slicing through snow, smoke, and the screams that rose from the burning hills. What had once been quiet ridges and frost-covered pines were now pillars of flame, entire slopes trembling under the thunder of American artillery. Private Liu Ren pressed himself into the frozen earth, his fingers clawing at the mud that no longer felt solid. Around him, men shouted into the storm of sound, their voices swallowed by the blast waves. Somewhere behind the ridgeline, a U.S. battery was firing in perfect rhythm, steel rain that fell without mercy or pause. He had been told this hill was impregnable, that numbers would win the war. That courage, not machines, decided history. The first shells had come before dawn, orange arcs slicing the darkness, followed by the deep, rolling crack that shook the snow from the trees. Then came another and another, until the entire ridge convulsed like a living thing. Men tried to move, to scatter, but there was nowhere to go. The earth itself had turned into an enemy. Liu's commander, Captain Zhou Feng, crouched beside him, his greatcoat scorched and torn. "Stay low," he shouted, though his voice was barely a whisper against the barrage. "They can't keep this up forever." But they did. Each minute stretched into eternity. Shrapnel cutting the air like rain. Dirt exploding into black smoke. Somewhere to his right, a soldier was screaming for his mother. To his left, another kept firing a useless rifle at the sky. Liu tried to count the explosions, but lost track after 50. The ground trembled so violently it felt alive, and through it all came the sickening smell of cordite and burned cloth. Above them, flares hung from parachutes, casting the battlefield in flickering daylight. In that ghastly glow, Liu saw what no man should see, the hills themselves glowing red like iron pulled from a forge. He pressed his forehead into the mud and whispered a prayer that vanished into the roar. Before that night, he had believed the war could be won by bravery alone. Now, he was learning what American fire truly meant. Weeks before the hills turned to fire, the valleys of North Korea were alive with movement. Endless columns of men, tens of thousands, snaked through the frozen passes like black rivers. They carried rifles, mortars, and faith. No tanks, no trucks, just legs hardened by miles and hearts filled with certainty. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army had entered Korea with one unshakable belief, that numbers could break machines. The Soviet advisors in Antung had warned them about American artillery, radar-guided, precise, and relentless. But to men like Captain Zhou Feng, war was not a contest of technology. It was endurance, discipline, and will. Liu remembered the night before they reached the front. Snow drifted through the pines, and the men huddled around small, smokeless fires, their breath steaming in the cold. Zhou spoke quietly, his voice calm but resolute. "The Americans think we are afraid of their shells," he said, "but they fight with distance. We fight with heart. When we are close enough to see their eyes, they will break." The soldiers nodded, their faces young and drawn, some barely old enough to shave. They spoke of home, of villages far across the Yalu River, of family fields now empty. They were proud to be the sons of a revolution that had beaten the Japanese and unified a nation. Korea, they were told, would be no different. By early December, intelligence reports said the Americans were dug in across a chain of hills south of the Imjin River. The Chinese plan was simple: attack at night, overwhelm the positions before sunrise, and finish the war by spring. It was not arrogance, it was faith in the same logic that had carried them through civil war and victory against stronger foes. Their route to the front was a nightmare of frostbite and exhaustion. The temperature fell below -20 at night. Boots froze to feet, rifles to fingers. Yet still, the columns marched, silent, disciplined, unstoppable. Every man carried rice, grenades, and ammunition. Every man believed the next dawn would bring triumph. When they reached the staging ground, Liu saw the hills for the first time. They looked small against the horizon, dotted with pines and dusted in snow. Somewhere beyond them lay American lines, invisible but waiting. Zhu studied them through binoculars and smiled. "This," he said softly, "is where history will kneel." The following morning, orders rippled down the frozen valleys like whispers in a monastery, concise, unquestioned, and absolute. Battalion commanders spread maps across the snow, marking assault routes with twigs and stones. Each hill had a number, not a name. Hill 266, Hill 317, Hill 339. Faceless shapes that would soon drink the blood of men who had never seen a map before. American observation planes circled high above, their contrails thin and sharp against the pale winter sky. Liu watched them glint in the sunlight and thought they looked harmless, like silver birds. But each pass meant another coordinate relayed to the batteries waiting beyond the horizon. By noon, the first supply mules arrived, their breaths clouding the air. They carried crates of mortar shells, dried noodles, and medical bandages frozen solid. Zhou's men dug into the permafrost, carving bunkers and trenches with bare hands and stolen shovels. They worked in silence, their breath coming out in rhythmic bursts, like steam engines struggling through snow. As the sun fell behind the western ridge, Zhou climbed onto a rock and looked down at his men. "Tonight," he said, "we remind the enemy that the earth still belongs to those who walk upon it." The signal came at midnight. A green flare arced high into the air, then burst, a flower of light against the frozen sky. Instantly, the ridges came alive. Thousands of men surged forward from the blackness, moving like shadows through the snow. The ground shuddered beneath their boots. For a brief, electric moment, the world was pure momentum, silent, unstoppable, eternal. Then the first American shell landed. It was distant, almost polite, a thud that echoed across the valley. Then came another, closer, sharper. Within seconds, the night became a symphony of thunder. The sky erupted in waves of orange and white, each blast carving holes in the darkness. The soldiers scattered, stumbling through the snow, falling into shell craters already filled with the dead. Liu had never seen fire behave this way. Alive, searching, deliberate. The shells landed with terrifying precision, as if the Americans could see through the night itself. Each explosion tore the air apart, shredding the illusion that courage alone could stop it. By dawn, the attack had collapsed. Hundreds lay buried beneath the snow, their rifles still clutched in frozen hands. The survivors crawled back to the ravine, their eyes hollow, their lips cracked from smoke and frost. Captain Zhou did not speak. He simply stood at the ridge, watching the distant American lines flicker with muzzle flashes and the faint, rhythmic pounding of guns that never seemed to tire. In that silence, Liu realized what his commander was thinking, that they had misjudged the world. Numbers had met machinery, and the earth had chosen its side. The days that followed were not battles, they were endurance tests, written in blood and smoke. Snow melted under fire and refroze into glassy crusts that cut through boots and skin. The wounded screamed until their throats turned raw, and then they simply stopped. Liu and what was left of his platoon hid in a hollow beneath the ridge, surrounded by shattered pines and the blackened skeletons of men. The ground itself seemed to pulse, trembling with each distant blast from the American guns. The smell of burned powder mixed with something colder, heavier, iron and grief. At night, the sky never turned dark anymore. Artillery flares hung above the hills like frozen suns, bathing everything in pale green light. Under that ghostly glow, Liu saw what courage looked like when it was stripped of speeches and orders, men crawling out to rescue their wounded comrades, knowing the next shell could erase them. Captain Zhou moved among the survivors with the calm of a priest, walking through the aftermath of a storm. His uniform was scorched, one sleeve torn, but his voice never trembled. "We do not retreat," he told them quietly. "We endure." But even endurance had limits. For every shell that fell, another trench vanished. For every squad that advanced at night, only half returned. The Chinese officers tried to adapt, digging deeper, spreading out, using the fog for cover, but the Americans adjusted faster. The fire came heavier, sharper, guided by radar and eyes in the sky. By the third night, the valley had become a living furnace. The U.S. artillery batteries, 155mm howitzers and 105mm M2 guns, unleashed such a torrent that the horizon itself seemed to move. Dirt and snow lifted like waves. The sound was beyond hearing. It became something physical, something you felt in your chest, like a hand pressing down on your lungs. Liu found himself clinging to the earth, eyes shut, whispering the only words he could remember, his mother's name. Around him, men wept, prayed, screamed for orders that never came. When dawn finally crept across the mountains, the hills were gone, flattened, erased, turned to black, steaming craters. The few who survived blinked through the haze, their faces streaked with soot, their rifles useless beneath the ash. Captain Zhou stood again, motionless. His men gathered what little strength they had left. No one spoke of victory anymore, only of survival. But in the distance, from the ridge beyond the smoke, came a sound that froze every man where he stood, the low hum of American engines. The next phase was coming. The sound grew louder, a deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to crawl through the ground. Then, through the mist, the silhouettes appeared. Tanks, dozens of them, their tracks ground through the blackened snow, turrets turning slowly like metal beasts sniffing for life. The men froze, their breath hanging white in the ruined air. Liu gripped his rifle, though he knew it was useless against armor. Even Captain Zhou, who had stared down every kind of fear, hesitated for a heartbeat. The American armor advanced with measured calm. Shermans and Pershings, their hulls streaked with soot, engines purring under the thin winter sun. Behind them, infantry followed in staggered lines, rifles ready, faces hidden by goggles and scarves. There was no rush, no shouting, no chaos, just a relentless, methodical push forward. Zhou whispered, "They fight like they already own the ground." An artillery observer, somewhere in the back, tapped coordinates into a radio. A minute later, the thunder began again. Shells screamed overhead, bursting along the ridgeline where Chinese stragglers tried to hold. The explosions rolled in perfect rhythm, boom, pause, like a drumbeat marking the end of something. The Chinese troops tried to regroup. Machine gun nests opened fire, tracers cutting through the smoke, but the Americans didn't flinch. The tanks rotated, spat fire, and entire bunkers vanished. Each shot landed with cruel precision, each burst kicking up another storm of dirt and flame. Liu's unit fell back to the riverbed. What had once been frozen solid, but now ran black with melted snow and ash. There, amid shattered helmets and the twisted frames of field guns, he found Joe kneeling, his hands trembling for the first time. "Numbers mean nothing," Joe muttered, almost to himself. "We sent 10 men for every one of theirs. And still, the earth burns beneath us." The survivors waited for night to fall, hoping the darkness would bring safety. But even the dark betrayed them. The Americans fired illumination rounds, floating stars that turned the valley into daylight. The sky rained light and fire in equal measure. When morning came, the hills that had once carried so much faith were gone, carved flat by the hands of steel and flame. The Chinese offensive, meant to crush the Americans through sheer will, had instead been swallowed by a storm of artillery that knew no mercy. Liu sat among the ruins, snow mixing with ash, his uniform still smoldering. For the first time, he felt no hatred, no pride, only awe. He looked at the distant American lines, at the guns that had silenced an army, and whispered, "They don't fight with men, they fight with thunder." January 1951. The war had frozen into a stalemate, but the silence was the most deceptive weapon of all. Smoke still hung over the hills north of Seoul, where snow covered shell craters like white bandages over open wounds. Liu and the remnants of his regiment huddled in dugouts carved into the frozen slope. Once, they had sung patriotic songs into the night. Now, they whispered, careful not to let their breath give them away. The fires that once kept them warm were gone. Even light had become an enemy. Captain Joe, the man who had once mocked American cowardice behind machines, sat in silence with a notebook in his lap. Inside it, lines of coordinates and supply counts had been scratched out, replaced by crude sketches of guns, firing angles, and trajectories. His arrogance had turned into study. "I used to think bravery was louder," Joe said quietly, watching the distant flashes on the horizon. "Now I see it hides behind math." Every night, Liu would climb the ridge with a small field scope scavenged from a fallen officer. Across the valley, he could see American fire bases, neat rows of sandbags, radar dishes, turning like patient eyes, and barrels glinting under the moon. They looked less like soldiers, more like a machine that breathed. For weeks, both sides tested each other in small bursts. Patrols, ambushes, probing artillery. The Chinese had no answer for the range and coordination of American fire. A single misfire of a flare could summon an avalanche of shells that tore through entire trenches. Then came the order that would change everything. Not from Joe, but from the higher command. Attack Hill 347. Break the enemy line before dawn. Joe stared at the paper for a long time before handing it to Liu. "They still believe numbers can break the sky," he said bitterly. The men prepared in silence. Ammunition was scarce, rations had frozen solid, and many carried rifles older than themselves. Yet they went forward, not out of faith, but duty. At 4 a.m., the valley erupted. Hundreds of Chinese troops surged uphill in the dark, their shouts swallowed by wind. For a brief moment, They reached the American wire, a chaos of bayonets and muzzle flashes. Liu felt the shock of steel meeting flesh, the cold sting of blood on his cheek. Then the mountain itself answered. The US guns opened up with terrifying precision. 155mm howitzers, 105mm light artillery, mortars, and recoilless rifles, all firing in orchestrated rhythm. The ridge pulsed with light, and the ground beneath the attackers disintegrated. Liu hit the dirt, covering his head. Around him, the hillside folded into a storm of dust and screaming metal. Each shell carved away another piece of the world. Men disappeared mid-step, their bodies erased before they could fall. Joe shouted for retreat, but his voice vanished in the roar. When the barrage finally ceased, only silence remained, a silence so deep it rang in their ears like a bell. Half the regiment was gone. The others stumbled back through smoke and shattered snow, no longer an army, just shadows of one. Joe limped beside Liu, his notebook still clutched in his hand. His face was streaked with soot, but his eyes were clear. "Now I understand," he said hoarsely. "They don't fight for pride or for country. They fight so the next bombardment never comes to their sons." The lesson had burned itself into him, not with words, but with fire. The next dawn, Joe tore the red flag patch from his sleeve and stuffed it into his pocket, not out of betrayal, but remembrance. For the first time since the war began, he no longer saw the Americans as demons. He saw them as mirrors, men who had mastered the very storm that now haunted his dreams. The artillery had done more than kill. It had changed what it meant to be brave. The days that followed were unlike anything Liu had known. Snow kept falling, soft and silent, covering the blackened ground. It was as if nature itself was trying to forget what had happened. But the smell of cordite and the faint hum of distant engines kept the memory alive. The survivors gathered what was left of their unit, fewer than 100 men from what had once been a regiment of 1,200. The field medics were gone, the radios silent, and food had to be dug out from under frozen corpses. No orders came from command. The hills had swallowed the voices that once told them where to die. Captain Joe stopped waiting for instructions. Each morning, he stood at the mouth of the trench and studied the American lines across the valley. Then he began teaching, not politics, not slogans, but survival. He sketched in the snow how the US artillery spotted targets, how their forward observers marked coordinates, how timing and distance turned chaos into control. "These are not monsters," he told the men. "They are students of destruction. If we live, we must learn faster than they teach." It was the first time Liu saw a Chinese officer speak without a hint of ideology. Something had shifted, not just in Joe, but in all of them. The dream of glorious sacrifice had burned away. What remained was raw endurance. At night, when the wind stopped and the stars glowed cold and sharp, Liu would listen to the Americans broadcasting propaganda on loudspeakers. The voice was calm, in broken Mandarin, promising warm meals, medicine, and the end of pointless death. The men laughed at first. Then, one by one, they stopped laughing. By late February, Joe's unit had retreated deeper into the mountains. They moved like ghosts, avoiding contact, living off snow and stolen rations. Every step forward was a choice between pride and survival. Then, one afternoon, while scouting near the valley's edge, Liu found a strange sight. An American artillery piece, silent and abandoned. Its barrel was bent from a direct hit, its crew long gone. The weapon that had once ruled the hills lay half buried in frost. a dead god among mortals. Joe approached it slowly, resting his hand on the cold steel. "Even thunder can fall silent," he said softly, "but only after it's done its work." For the first time, Liu saw peace in his commander's eyes. Not defeat, not surrender, but acceptance. The kind of peace that comes only after a man understands the limits of both hate and courage. When they finally moved on, Joe looked back one last time at the ruined gun. "Remember this," he said to Liu. "War is not won by numbers, nor by faith. It's won by whoever learns first what fire costs." The snow began again, thick and endless, wrapping the world in a white hush. Somewhere in the distance, American artillery thundered once more. But this time, it no longer sounded like power. It sounded like warning. And in that warning lay the quiet turn of history, where arrogance melted and understanding began. The smoke of that lesson would carry them into the next battle and into the slow, unraveling collapse that was to come. March 1951. The thaw had begun. The rivers that once froze solid under the boots of retreating men now ran grey with melted snow and blood. Hills that had been carved by artillery looked like the bones of the earth itself, stripped bare and silent. Liu's unit had become wanderers. They no longer marched in formation or carried banners. Their rifles were slung loose, their coats torn and stiff with frost. Each man was haunted by the same unspoken truth. They were fighting a war that had already changed beyond recognition. The Chinese High Command ordered new offensives across central Korea, desperate to regain lost ground. But what moved across the hills now were not armies. They were remnants, weary and thin, trudging through mud toward a horizon lit by distant artillery. Captain Joe led what was left of his men westward, skirting the valleys known for being killing grounds. He had stopped caring about orders that made no sense. His only goal was to keep them alive. On the 5th day of the march, they stumbled upon the aftermath of another failed attack. Bodies lay scattered across a narrow ridge, both Chinese and American, their uniforms indistinguishable beneath a crust of dirt and snow. The smell hit before the sight did. Flies, even in this cold, refused to die. Liu found a folded letter in the pocket of an American sergeant. It was addressed simply, "Dear Anna." He couldn't read all of it, but a few words stood out. "Home, Christmas, safe soon." For a moment, the war shrank to something painfully small. One man writing to another life he'd never see again. When Liu showed it to Joe, the captain said nothing. He took the letter, tore it in half, and handed one piece back. "Keep it," he said, "to remember that every shell that falls lands on someone's story." That night, they sheltered in the ruins of a farmhouse, its roof gone, its walls cracked by fire. Outside, artillery flares lit the horizon, each one followed by the slow roll of thunder. Joe traced a map in the dirt, marking American supply routes. "They fight with logic," he murmured. "Every shell, every move, nothing wasted." Liu nodded, remembering the day the valley had turned to fire. "And we fight with faith," he replied, "faith that burns too quickly." Joe gave a tired smile. "Then we must learn patience. Even fire can be tamed if you learn its rhythm." But patience was a luxury they didn't have. 2 days later, a column of U.S. artillery spotted their movement through drone-like observation planes, unseen eyes that hovered high in the blue. Within minutes, shells began to fall in a perfect grid, closing every exit. The men dove for cover as the earth exploded around them. The sound was deafening. Not a barrage, but a sequence, like a machine calculating death. Trees snapped, rocks shattered, and the mountains seemed to breathe dust. Joe was hit by a fragment, a deep gash across his thigh. Liu dragged him into a ditch, pressing his coat against the wound. Joe's face was pale, his voice calm. "They see everything," he whispered, "even when we hide." Hours passed before the shelling stopped. When it did, the world was unrecognizable, a graveyard of steel and smoke. The men were scattered, broken, and in that silence, a kind of liberation began to take shape, not from capture or rescue, but from illusion. For the first time, they no longer believed they could win through numbers. What survived now was something smaller, harder, more human, the will to simply live. Joe looked up at the dark sky, where faint streaks of jet trails cut across the clouds. "Liu," he said faintly, "promise me you'll live long enough to tell how we learned." Liu squeezed his hand, though words felt too heavy to use. The fire around them was dying, but in its place rose something cleaner, understanding. That understanding would carry Liu through what came next. The final collapse and the quiet reckoning waiting beyond the hills. The next morning broke with a colorless dawn, pale light over gray snow, smoke rising in lazy spirals from the cratered valley below. Liu woke to silence, the kind that follows after everything that can be destroyed has been. Around him, scattered bodies lay half-buried in ash and frost. He no longer knew how many were his men and how many were theirs. Captain Joe still breathed, but weakly. His uniform was stiff with dried blood. His notebook clutched tight against his chest. When Liu tried to take it, Joe shook his head. "No," he whispered. "Not yet. This is all that's left of order." They waited until nightfall before trying to move. The American artillery had shifted further south, hunting other targets. The air was heavy with cordite and the faint hum of distant engines. Every few minutes, flares flickered along the ridgeline, painting the world in white for a heartbeat, then returning it to black. They trudged north through burned-out forests, through what was once farmland. The earth itself seemed to carry memory, every step a reminder of thunder that had fallen days before. Joe leaned heavily on Liu as they walked. His strength was fading, but his mind was still sharp. "You know," he murmured, "we used to laugh at them, said they were afraid of close combat. But they were never afraid. They just learned to kill from far enough away to see the whole map." Liu didn't answer. There was no point in words anymore. Only the sound of their boots in the mud and the wind sliding through the skeletal trees. They reached a ridge at dawn and looked down on what had once been a Chinese encampment, now a crater field. The snow was black with soot, the trenches filled with frozen water. Among the wreckage stood an overturned artillery shell, half buried but intact, its fins gleaming in the weak sunlight. Joe stared at it for a long time. "It's strange," he said softly. "We called them devils. But devils don't build weapons that precise. They build chaos. This is something else, something almost divine." Then, as if the admission cost him the last of his strength, Joe slumped against a tree. Liu caught him before he fell, lowering him gently to the ground. Joe's hand tightened briefly around Liu's sleeve. "Tell them," he whispered. "Tell them we weren't fools. We learned. Too late, maybe, but we learned." His hand went still. The wind carried his last breath into the cold. Liu sat beside him until the light changed, from gray to gold to nothing. The war around him continued, but for Liu, it had ended there, beside that silent artillery shell and a man who had finally understood his enemy. He buried Joe under a layer of snow and stones, marking the spot with the captain's torn red patch. Then, alone, he walked down into the valley toward the faint sound of engines, American engines, and the distant promise of surrender. The war had burned away everything, faith, command, illusion, but what remained was something purer, the truth that no man truly wins in fire. That truth would follow him long after the guns fell silent, long after the hills healed. It was the truth he would one day tell, when the world was ready to listen. And that story would not end with defeat, but with release. Spring came quietly to the Korean hills, like a guest afraid to enter a house that still smoldered. The rivers ran full again, carrying ashes of bridges and bones alike. Birds returned, nesting in the twisted ribs of destroyed artillery, as if claiming what the war had left behind. Liu was one of the few survivors captured in those weeks. The Americans found him near the Imjin River, frostbitten, unarmed, half-delirious with hunger. They didn't shoot. They wrapped him in a wool blanket, gave him water, and led him to a truck marked with a red cross. For the first time in years, he felt human hands that didn't strike him. At the POW camp, the war seemed far away, though its echoes never stopped. The camp itself was a paradox, barbed wire and kindness in the same place. The guards were cautious, but not cruel. They spoke in English, slow and careful, sometimes offering cigarettes or tinned food. To Liu, each gesture was disorienting. He had been taught that mercy was weakness. Now, it was keeping him alive. He shared a tent with captured soldiers from his own army, men who no longer saluted, no longer shouted slogans. Their eyes were hollow, but calmer now. The sound of artillery had been replaced by the low hum of generators and the scratch of pens on paper. The Americans encouraged writing, reports, letters, even diaries. For the record, they said, Liu wrote because Joe would have wanted him to. His notebook was filled with memories, the smell of gunpowder, the heat of the barrages, the snow that turned black at dawn. He wrote of how Captain Joe changed, how pride became understanding, and how the hills had burned not out of hate, but precision. Sometimes, at night, he would stand at the edge of the fence and watch the American sentries pacing. They looked tired, too, boys far from home, walking in circles beneath foreign stars. One of them, a young corporal, would nod to him each night. They never spoke, but the nod said everything. "You're alive. I see you." By summer, Liu had learned a few English words, enough to understand the guards talking about ceasefire, negotiations, and Panmunjom. Hope crept back into the camp, fragile as the grass pushing through the dirt. But with hope came memory. Each sound of a distant plane, each rumble of thunder, pulled him back to the valleys of fire. He would wake drenched in sweat, hearing the whine of shells in dreams that never ended. And yet, in the quiet, after each nightmare, he would remember Joe's last words. "Tell them we learned." He realized that survival was not just about living through the war. It was about carrying its lessons forward, refusing to let them be buried under slogans or lies. So he wrote more, pages and pages, about how fire can teach, how thunder can speak, and how the hills that once burned could one day grow green again. Outside the camp, spring turned to summer. The cicadas began their endless song, rising and falling like the echo of distant artillery, but softer, almost peaceful. In those sounds, Liu found something he hadn't felt since before the war began. Forgiveness, not for the enemy, but for himself. The war ended, not with victory parades, but with signatures on paper. July 27, 1953. Panmunjom. A line was drawn across a map, a border of silence splitting a single land in two. But for men like Liu, there were no borders left, only memories that didn't recognize sides. He was released later that autumn, one of thousands of prisoners traded back under the grey sky. The trucks rolled past fields still scarred by craters, past villages that no longer had names. When Liu crossed back into Chinese territory, there was no welcome. Only an officer who took his papers and said, "You have seen too much. You will speak only of victory." But silence had become unbearable. In the years that followed, Liu worked as a laborer on the border railroads, his body surviving what his spirit could not forget. At night, he would climb the hills above the camps and listen to the wind, always searching for the sound of artillery that never came again. And sometimes, in the distance, he could almost hear Captain Joe's voice carried through the trees. Even thunder can fall silent, but only after it's done its work. He kept the half of the letter he had found on that dead American sergeant, the piece that read, "Safe soon." He carried it through every winter, folded inside his jacket, as if it could protect him from the cold truth of memory. One summer evening, years later, Liu sat with his son beside a stream, teaching him to skip stones. The child asked, "Did you ever see the Americans?" Liu paused, watching the circles spread across the water. "Yes," he said softly, "they were like us, tired, afraid, and following orders written by men who never saw the hills burn." His son nodded, not understanding, and threw another stone. The ripples spread, wider, slower, until the water went still again. Liu closed his eyes, and for the first time, he didn't see fire. He saw rain, falling quietly over the same hills that once blazed with artillery, washing the scars clean, turning the craters into ponds where reeds grew tall. Time had done what armies could not. It had returned peace to the ground. In that silence, he whispered to the wind, as if speaking to Joe himself. "We learned, old friend. Maybe too late, but we learned." And as the dusk settled over the Korean hills, those hills that once turned to fire, the sound that rose was not thunder nor gunfire, but the soft hum of life returning. If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again. Because in the end, war doesn't make heroes, it makes stories, and POW Tales exists to make sure they're never forgotten.